Hi, my friends. Today we are going to begin our conversation talking about Abraham. Fair warning before we get into this. To talk about Abraham is necessarily to talk about some pretty violent or weird conversations just by nature of what the story looks like. So we are going to be covering some rather mature themes as we talk about Abraham. But I promise these are things that are actually crucial to our understanding of not only the Old Testament story, but for the story of the whole Bible. What happens here with Abraham and some of the grittier and more scary parts are actually crucial to what is going to happen through Jesus and God's redemption of the world. If you'll remember, we talked about at the beginning of the year, a lot of times these gross stories, especially as they show up in the Bible, actually serve as a message of hope for us, that God enters into our grossness and the bad parts of our lives. God doesn't just come into a clean world. He comes into a world that's broken and he heals it. He's not scared of those messy and gritty parts of our life. So I just wanted to give you that kind of fair warning as we go into this. Without further ado, let's jump in. So we're going to cover 4 parts of Abraham's life today, going from Genesis 12 to Genesis 17. So today, or for this part, we're going to start with Genesis 12, and then we'll move on from there. So let's talk about these 3 parts of Genesis 12 that I want to cover. So Genesis 12, there's 3 things that happen. First thing, God comes to Abraham and he says, go somewhere. Second thing he does is he says that he's going to make Abraham into what I've started calling the blessing water hose. And we'll explain a little bit more of what that means. But basically, through Abraham, God is going to bless the world, kind of like he's aiming Abraham around, and his blessing is going to come out of Abraham and hit the rest of the world. And then after a little bit, after God sends Abraham off onto his little journey, kind of going wherever, we're going to find him ending up in the land of Canaan. So let's talk about each of these individually. So the first thing happens, God tells Abraham, hey, go to a land I will show you. He doesn't give him direction. He just says, leave. And I think this is really important, right? Abraham knows Haran. Seemingly, Abraham's been there for a little while. And as a nomad, uncertainty is bad across the board. I mean, Abraham's livelihood depends on being able to find pasture land for his sheep. If he's been in Haran for a while, he knows the places he can take his sheep to. He knows the people he can talk to get different goods from, to get textiles or to get baskets or something like that, right? He's made connections. He knows where he needs to be, where he doesn't need to be up in Haran. To go somewhere else in the life of a nomad is almost certain death. To have that kind of uncertainty, that's tough. That's hard. He doesn't even have the ability to kind of plan for what kind of conditions he's going to be in. What does he need to prep for? What does he need to start stocking up on? He has nothing. And so when God tells Abram, hey, go, this is Abraham risking a lot. And yet we see a pattern that's going to be repeated by Abraham. Abram has faith. He follows God where God calls him to go. And this is kind of a wild act of faith to just up and leave, not really knowing where you're going. God then tells Abram, I'm going to bless you. But specifically, God says, Abram, I'm going to bless you for a reason. It is not simply to bless you so that you can show off to the rest of the world and be like, look, I'm the best and I'm awesome. Rather, God is blessing Abram so that the rest of the world can be blessed through him. This is that blessing water hose I was talking about. God uses Abraham, blesses him. Yes, it's true, but for the explicit purpose of blessing the rest of the world through Abram. Now, this is a lesson that Israel is going to forget regularly. In fact, it's one of the big gripes Jesus is going to have with the Pharisees. Israel is going to recognize we are the chosen people. We're the descendants of Abraham. We're the ones that God loves the most, and God has blessed us. And Jesus' response, not just Jesus, but the prophets throughout the rest of the Old Testament are going to say, yes, God has blessed you so that the rest of the world can be blessed. You're special in that you are a tool, not that you're better than anyone. God has chosen you to use you to bless the world. And when Israel forgets that, they lose sight of their purpose. So God blesses Abraham so that he can in turn become a blessing. We talked about in class how we start to see a pattern emerging from God. And the example I gave was sometimes I get frustrated with God when I think about the need for missionaries. Like you hear stories about people having visions of Jesus, or even think about Paul. Paul is whenever he gets blinded at Damascus, is because Jesus shows up to him. And I kind of start wondering, God, why don't you just do that all the time? Like, why are you getting people to do this stuff when we're fallible? What we're finding is that God has started to show a pattern here in the book of Genesis of desiring to partner with people to do his work. God partners with Adam and Eve. He makes the garden, but then he invites them to make the rest of the world like the garden. God wants to make a new humanity, but instead of just wiping it out and starting over, he partners with Noah, and through Noah makes a new humanity. And he's going to do the same thing with Abram. God wants to bless the world, but he doesn't just bless the world. He partners with Abram and blesses the whole world. The example we used is talking about when I think I was 9. It was either 7 or I was 9, I can't remember. My dad had this 2004 blue Chevy Silverado, and the serpentine belt had snapped on it. He needed to put a new one on there. So my dad is a pretty handy man. It could have taken him about 15 minutes to get that serpentine belt put on. But instead, he drags me out of the recliner, out of watching TV, and he brings me out to start fixing the serpentine belt. And like 4 hours later, I have replaced the serpentine belt. Now, why? Why does my dad do that? Well, it's because my dad's primary goal was not fixing the truck. My dad's primary goal was making me into the kind of person who could then fix the truck. I think we're seeing something similar here with how God is partnering with humanity. God partners with humanity because, yes, he wants to redeem the world, but he also wants to shape us into his images, into people who are sub-creators, co-creators with God, who through God, yes, God's going to bless the world. He's going to bless it through Abraham. And in that process, Abraham is going to become more like God as one who blesses the world, right? God wants to make Adam and Eve sub-creators. So he doesn't just make the whole world a garden. He puts a garden and then uses them to learn how to become sub-creators like God, right? God is constantly partnering with people because that's how he operates. He cares about us being shaped into bearers of his justice and his mercy in the world. And finally, after Abram leaves, he's left. He's been given this promise that he's going to be blessed to be a blessing. And finally, God tells him, hey, in the middle of your wandering, where you're at right now, where you guys have kind of been camped out, wandering around for a bit, this is the place. And this is the first time that we see this really important theme show up of the promised land. God tells Abram, hey, this area, this land of Canaan that you're in, all the way from this river to this river, from this spot to this spot, here is where your descendants are going to own and run it. And importantly for Abraham, this is pretty confusing because there's a lot of people who live here right now. I told the students it's kind of similar to if you were walking in a neighborhood and God came down to you and said, hey, you see all these houses in this neighborhood? You're going to live there one day. And you kind of have to wonder, are we going to kick out the neighbors? What? God, is that a threat? What are you doing, right? So there's still some holes left here, but we have the promise. This land is promised. Does it really make sense how it's going to happen? And I'm not really sure if it's even possible to happen. I mean, a lot of people live here, but the land has been promised. And that's kind of what Genesis 12 is doing, is giving us a framework for what's going to happen in the rest of our Abraham and Israel story. So I want to move on to Genesis 15, because now we're starting to get to a little bit more of the meat and potatoes of what God is going to do with Abraham. So here's the 3 things I want to cover in Genesis 15. Number 1, God is going to promise Abram a multitude of descendants. Number 2, we're going to see that Abraham's response is to believe God and that is counted to him as righteousness. And most importantly of all, we see for the first time God is going to come to Abraham and establish a covenant with him. And that covenant is going to change the course of history for the rest of the world. And I'm really excited about how this is going to go. So let's start talking about this multitude. God has promised Abram that through Abram, he is going to bless the world. When God tells Abram here in Genesis 15, hey, look at the stars, see if you can count them, that's how many your descendants are going to be, we're starting to get an idea of how God is going to bless the world, right? These descendants are going to be the means by which God blesses the world. That's why he says, hey, I'm going to turn your descendants, here in Genesis 15, into a great nation. Somehow, God is going to bless the world through Abraham. We knew that in Genesis 12. But in Genesis 15, we find that the way God is going to do that is to create a great nation from his descendants so that they can then bless the world. I can't stress this enough. This reason, this purpose for the blessing of Israel is crucial to understanding the rest of the Old Testament. God, yes, makes Israel his chosen people for the purpose of blessing the rest of the earth. They are not just his chosen people for no reason. They're his chosen people so that the rest of the world will soon come into the fold also. It's a very important distinction. So now I want to move to this phrase that we see said of Abraham. Abraham believed God and was counted to him as righteousness. Now, when we hear this word believed, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind is something that we think, something that we say even. But whenever we see the word believed show up in the Old Testament, there's a little bit more depth there than what we might often think. I want to talk about that real quick. The example I like to use is actually talking about earthquakes. So let's say you lived out on the West Coast. If the tectonic plates are like building up and then they snap, and the earthquake's about to happen, the first thing you're going to feel is just a subtle vibration is going to come through, right? When that happens, you know that you've got just a couple minutes, maybe a minute, before the next wave, the happens. And that's the destructive one, right? So the first wave is one thing, and it's just kind of like a signal. The second wave is where things start to get bad. So let's imagine, you live out here somewhere on the West Coast, and you work like second floor of an office building. You know if there's an earthquake, if you want to survive, you're going to run outside, try to get away from the building, maybe something like that. Whatever your plan is, there's a plan that you follow, and if you go follow that plan, you'll be okay. Well, if you claim to, you're sitting in class, or you're sitting in your office building, and then you feel the happen, you're probably going to take that as a signal, right? If you feel that vibration, then you go, an earthquake's coming, a big one's coming, I got to get out of here. Well, if you truly believe that, then you're going to run, right? Can you imagine if somebody says they feel the like, and then they go, yes, an earthquake's coming. They just sit there? Does that person truly believe an earthquake's coming? Either no, or they just have a death wish of some kind, right? The things that we believe are going to affect the way that we act. If I think an earthquake is coming, it's going to affect where I stand. I'm not going to stand next to a skyscraper because an earthquake's coming, right? The things that we think, if we truly think them, they're going to affect the way that we act. That's just how belief works. Specifically in the Old Testament, for Abraham to believe something, Abraham is not going to say he believed God and then do something totally opposite of what God said. Abraham, we notice, doesn't go around sulking because he's not going to have any kids. He seems to truly believe that God is going to give him these descendants. This idea of belief in the Old Testament usually requires action with it. If you believe something, it's going to change the things that you do, right? I want you to notice, though, that this is still, for my Protestant brothers and sisters, this is still faith alone. Right? Think about the Apostle James. The Apostle James says faith without works is dead. He's saying something different than Paul's saying. And whenever we get to our New Testament class, we'll talk about that there. But James is saying, listen, you think that God is one, good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. Right? If you have faith, the Apostle James says it's going to change the things that you do because you think something is true. Right? Faith and action are two sides of the same coin. And what James says is that if you have faith and it doesn't produce action, then you don't actually have faith. And we're seeing that show up here in the Abraham story. Because Abraham believed God, he is now doing the things that God asks him to do. And God credits that to him as righteousness. So let's move on to one more part here in Genesis 15. The single most important part of Genesis 15 is this idea of covenant. It's the first covenant we see with Abraham, and we've already talked about it a little bit in an earlier section of this course. But it starts here. God tells Abram, hey, you're going to have a ton of kids. And Abram says, how can I possibly trust you? Our only conversation so far was you telling me to leave everyone that I love, and then showing up a number of years later being like, hey, glad you're here. You're going to have kids. How can I trust you? That's Abram's question. And it's here that we see the ceremony that we talked about earlier on in the course, right? God has Abram take all these animals and cut them in half, and you have the suzerainty treaty, right? The vassal, Abram, the suzerain, God. Normally you'd expect the vassal to walk through, but instead Yahweh walks through, saying, Abram, if you break the covenant, I will be the one who suffers the consequences. We see Jesus prefigured here, right? How can Abram trust God? Well, God makes a covenant with him. He says, Abram, I swear on my life, and that's a big deal because God's life is eternal, right? I swear on my life that I will uphold my end of the covenant, even if you fail to hold up your end of the covenant. We have to notice something here. When God makes a covenant, something changes. When God tells Abram in chapter 12, hey, I'm gonna give you this land. We see that God oftentimes, if God promises something and then the people are unfaithful, God will often revoke that promise, right? Not because he's unfaithful, because he's like, hey, like I will protect you as long as you follow my laws. And then if people break the laws, then he's like, all right, well, you're going to get attacked now, right? Something changes whenever God makes this covenant, though. Because whenever God makes a covenant, it means that it is unretractable. God is swearing on his life that he will uphold this end of this part of the covenant. Abraham will never not be one of God's chosen people, and there's nothing in the world that will ever change that. Even if Abram breaks the covenant. Even if Abram breaks the covenant, he will stay part of God's chosen people, as we're actually going to see in the next story, unfortunately. Something is different here. This covenant is binding to God. If you want to think of it this way, covenants, whenever God makes a covenant like this, God says, I'm going to be your God, you're going to be my people. Even if God wanted to get out of this, he won't, because he has sworn. God cannot be a liar. And he's made this covenant saying that if you break this covenant, Abram, I'm going to die. That's heavy, right? The God who physically cannot lie makes a promise, makes this covenant here. That's not going to change. So it's here that we're going to get into some darker themes. God has just made this covenant with Abram in Genesis 15, and it seems like finally we found someone through whom God is going to bless the whole world. We're going to get back to Eden. The seventh day is on its way. But things go bad, and let's talk about that here. There's 4 things I want to cover in Genesis 16. First thing I want to talk about is Hagar. Hagar is this woman we're going to meet in this story. We're going to talk about what Sarah's plan is for Hagar. I want to talk about this idea of doing it myself. And then I want to talk about what God's response is to Hagar. So this is kind of the 4 parts of Genesis 16 I want to cover. So let's do that now. Let's talk about Hagar. Who is Hagar? Well, Hagar is some Egyptian slave that Sarah owns. Now, Hagar as a slave has less rights than even the normal woman in the ancient Near East, right? Already as a girl, she's seen as some kind of property. But if you were a freed woman, if you were like, say, Sarah, you still have some authority in your house, right? Seemingly, Sarah is in charge of her slaves. We see in Proverbs 31, the woman of the house is able to order her servants around. She kind of has dominion over the home. She still has some kind of freedom and some kind of authority. But as a slave, Hagar has nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. She is the dirt. Sarah can do whatever with Hagar that she wants to do. But importantly, there is a possibility for Hagar to be redeemed, right? We talk about redemption. Think like Ruth and Boaz. If a man comes by and sees Hagar, there's a real possibility that that man is going to see Hagar and go, oh, wow, she's beautiful. Abram, I'd like to marry her. If that happens, Hagar can be redeemed. Her life can start anew. She will no longer be a slave. She'll be a wife. She'll have her own house. And in that culture, I mean, that's all you could ever ask for. That's amazing. Her life could totally turn around. She would no longer be owned. She would be her own free person, as much as a woman could be in that time. But there's an important requirement. Because if Hagar is ever going to get married, she wants a chance of getting married, she has to remain a virgin. You see, in that society, if a woman was not a virgin, she would be considered used. And I want to really point out here, this is not something that Yahweh is affirming, right? We talk about this. God doesn't canonize Israel's culture. Just because the culture said that this woman who's not a virgin is considered used or kind of worthless does not mean that's what God thinks. In fact, we're going to see in the story that God is very opposed to that kind of language, right? He's going to fight against that cultural norm pretty heavily. But in order for Hagar to have a chance at a life, for her to be able to get out of this slave deal, she will have to remain a virgin. And if she can do that, then she'll have the chance to be redeemed. Well, let's talk about Sarah's plan now. So Sarah's old, right? At this point, Abram's in his 80s, late 80s maybe, and I think Sarah is either in her early 80s or late 70s. Old lady. And so her plan is to have what I've been calling a Pokeball baby. Those of you who've ever played Pokemon or know how it works, right? The way you capture a Pokemon, you take the little Pokeball, you throw it, and the Pokeball goes, and now that Pokemon is yours. Sarah's plan is to have Hagar have a baby with Abram. And then after Hagar gets pregnant and has that baby, Sarah is basically going to throw a Pokeball at that baby, and now that baby is hers. Oh, you had this baby? I had this baby. I'm going to steal that baby from you, and it's mine now. So that's Sarah's plan. And she tells Abram, hey, you should go sleep with my slave. And you can imagine Abram is a little like, whenever she says that. But we'll come back to this in a second. The text says that Abram listened to the voice of his wife. And this next part is really important. I want you to notice the language used of what Sarah does. Sarah took Hagar and gave her to Abram. Sarah took Hagar and gave her to Abram. I want you to remember Hagar's position. You see, Hagar as a slave cannot refuse a request of her masters. To do so would be to forfeit her life. She can't really run away. They live in the wilderness of Canaan. So to run away is certain death. To fight back is certain death. And then the biblical text is also giving us some clues that Hagar is not involved in the decision-making process of having this baby with Abram. As a slave to Abram, she is not going to be able to maintain the status of a wife, especially whenever we consider the fact that how is a wife going to stay in the family, be locked in? It's by having their own baby. But this baby is going to be Sarah's baby. Sarah's not following the conventions of ancient Near Eastern inheritance rules. This should save Hagar, but Sarah's explicitly making sure Hagar can't be saved here. Hagar is a rape victim. Sarah takes her slave and forces her slave to sleep with her 80-something-year-old husband. And then when she gets pregnant, she takes that baby away from Hagar. I want you to remember something else. What's the only way Hagar can make it out of this slave position? Is if she gets married. But if Hagar is pregnant, there's proof that she's not a virgin. And so her life is over. No one will want to marry her in that society. Any man who sees her will consider her used and worthless. And so by doing this, Sarah has effectively damned Hagar. Her life is ruined. She has been raped by Abram and is now unable to do anything except be a slave. I want us to notice something. The phrase that's used here is that Abe listened to Sarah. Abram listened to Sarah. And I'm not trying to make any point about like husbands listening to their wives. No. What we're getting is a callback. Because the last time we heard a phrase like this was in the garden. Adam listened to the voice of his wife. We're seeing this theme show up, that the way that humanity sins is God promises them something, gives them something beautiful, and they say, well, that doesn't seem right, but I can find a way to make it work. I can find a way to do it myself, to bring about this promise that God has offered me. God promised Adam and Eve eternal life. Eve goes, I don't know if that's true. We got to find a workaround. Let's get wisdom like God has. And Adam listens to Eve. God promises Abram multitudes and multitudes of descendants. And yet Sarah says, I don't know if that's possible. Let's find a workaround. I'll do it myself. This phrase, Abram listened to the voice of Sarah, is supposed to remind us of the original sin. That in Abram and Sarah is the exact same sin as Adam and Eve. The one that hears the promises of God, doesn't find them feasible, and thinks that they can find a better way to make that happen. I want to contrast this with a phrase that we hear all throughout the Psalms. Psalm 40, Psalm 45, Psalm 63. I waited for the Lord my God. I waited patiently. He in mercy heard my cry, inclined his ear to me. I waited for the Lord. I sought the Lord and he answered me. All of this phrase used over and over and over. What does the righteous person do? The righteous person waits for God to answer. The righteous person does not seek to by their own hand bring about what God is doing. But rather, if God promises something, the righteous person waits for God to do it. This desire to try to make it work on our own is the original sin. It's the sin of Adam and Eve, and we see Abram and Sarah do the exact same thing. A quick side note that I would notice here too is that the conversation that then happens between Abram and Sarah is pretty disgusting, and we'll talk about that here. Abram and Sarah begin to discuss whose fault it is, right? Sarah basically says, this woman that you got pregnant, she hates me now. Because what we see is that Hagar's response to getting pregnant is rage. A lot of times it's translated as like jealousy, to say like, oh, Hagar has the baby now I'm in charge, Sarah. But that's not it. The translation is much better. It's fury, it's anger, it's wrath. Hagar is furious at Sarah because her life has been ruined, as you would expect, right? And so Sarah comes to Abram and she says, this woman that you got pregnant hates me now. And you can kind of hear the hypocrisy there, right? And then Abram's response is, well, do with her what you want. She's yours. And what I find so fascinating about this is that the conversation about what to do with Hagar doesn't involve Hagar at all, right? You can kind of you can picture the story happening. Abram and Sarah are yelling at each other as to whose fault it is. Meanwhile, Hagar sits on the floor weeping because her life is ruined, right? And so we see that Sarah decides to treat with contempt or treat harshly Hagar, seemingly to beat. This is a pretty loaded language. So Sarah begins to beat this pregnant woman, who it's her fault she got pregnant in the first place. And so Hagar runs into the desert. Hagar flees to the desert where somehow living alone in the wilderness is safer than living with this woman, Sarah. Well, as she flees to the desert, we see the angel of the Lord, AOTL is what that means, the angel of the Lord actually comes to Hagar and meets her at the spring. This is what is the best part of this story. If you'll remember in the Judah and Tamar story, the culture that Tamar found herself in considered her worthless and meaningless. She's just this used woman. And yet God was like, if you hurt my baby, I will hurt you back. Tamar's my girl. We see something very similar here. Whenever Hagar, this woman who's considered useless and trash, is thrown to the side, God moves heaven and earth to meet her in the desert. A theme that we're going to see over and over again, God meeting his people in the desert. And then this just blows me away. She then receives, in essence, the same promise as Abraham. Abraham was promised descendants and land. Go read toward the end of Genesis 16, God's promise to Hagar, I'm going to give you descendants, multitudes and multitudes of descendants. And my favorite way to talk about her son, the son that Hagar is going to have, I like to describe as a Batman baby. This Ishmael, he is going to be a wild donkey of a man. Think about what that implies, right? If you've ever worked with donkeys, famously the most stubborn creatures in the world. If you want to get a donkey to do something it doesn't want to do, you're going to have a bad time. Think about Hagar's story up to this point. Hagar has maybe in the worst way been forced to do something she doesn't want to do, and God's gift to her is a son who will ensure that that never happens again. Right? A wild donkey of a man. And this, I think Batman is helpful, right? He's this Batman baby. Someone tries to pick on you again, Hagar. This son is going to beat the living daylights out of him. He will make sure that you are safe, that your inheritance is as great as Abram's is, minus the covenant that he receives. I really want to drive home that these women who are often considered so worthless in the culture that they found themselves in are now being seen by God as worthy of the same promise as his chosen people, parts of the same promise of his chosen people. God does not consider Hagar worthless. In fact, whenever she is brutalized, he does whatever he can to make sure that she's taken care of. So let's move to our last bit here in Genesis chapter 17. There's three things I want us to think about. The first is we're going to see a repeat of what God said in Genesis 15. We're going to see this emphasis on the fact that God is working through Abraham, that Abraham himself is not blessing the nations, but that God is blessing the nations through Abraham, beyond what he is capable of. And then we're going to get everybody's favorite sign of the covenant. So let's start with our repeat. The repeat is simple. God tells Abram once again, hey, I'm going to give you a multitude of descendants, and I'm going to give you this promised land. I promise I'm going to do it. And Abraham goes, cool, same page, I remember that. But then God does something interesting. God comes in and changes Abram's name. Now, Abram's name changes. You've probably heard me slip into both of them throughout our conversation today. Abram's name changes to Abraham. That H-A is basically changing Abram's name from the father of peoples to the father of many peoples. The father of peoples to the father of many peoples. Why is this name changing? Well, I actually think it has to do with what happens with Hagar in Genesis 16. God is effectively saying, it seems like we've had some kind of misunderstanding. What God promised Abram was that he would be the father of a multitude of nations, thousands upon thousands, more than could be counted in the sky. If that was going to happen, what Abram was going to have to do was going to be beyond the limits of a human body. Right? The Duggars only have 20 kids, and that does not a nation make. When Abraham realized, what Sarah realized, that they were too old, Abram thought, well, I have to find a way to make this work. And what God is saying by changing Abram's name is, Abram, you mishear me, brother. What I'm going to do is going to be a miracle. The number of descendants you're going to have is not something that you on your own could even do. So why are you trying to take it into your own hands? Why are you willing to ruin this woman's life in order to find some way by your own efforts to bring about this promise? Your body is limited. I am making your name the father of many peoples because what I'm going to do through you is not something that you can do. To put it differently, if you want to go back to our water hose analogy, Abraham is the blessing water hose. God is saying, hey, you might be this vessel I've chosen, but I am the water. I am the one who is going to bless these people. I am the one who's going to make something happen. Nothing you do is going to make that happen better or less. I have solemnly sworn that I will do this thing. This thing you did with Hagar where you thought you could help me, you thought you could find some way to make it work or see something that I didn't see, that's crazy, and actually that's sin. I need you to wait for me because I am the one working. I'm just using you. It's supposed to be a miracle, and all of that is being communicated in the fact that Abram's name is changed. It's an emphasis. It's a reminder, Abram, you're not doing this. Nothing you can do can make this happen. I am doing this. And when you try to make it happen, that's where sin sneaks in. And then we get to everybody's favorite part of the Old Testament. We get this sign of the covenant, this circumcision, the thing that makes every student I've ever had just squirm in their seat. And for good reason. It's weird, right? The question that I often get is like, why couldn't God just have them like get a haircut? It's like, all right, all of your descendants are going to have this haircut, or everybody gets this tattoo or something, right? There's all kinds of things you can do. Why'd God have to do that? That seems horrible and painful for no reason. Well, it's because I think there's a logic to it, and I want to try to explain that here. So again, mature conversations here, but I think it helps kind of prove a point of what God is trying to do with Abram. So remember, the promise. There's going to be many nations from you, Abram. And we just learned that this is going to be a miracle. This is something God is going to do through Abram. At this point, Abram is 99 years old. Sarah's 90, 89, something like that. These are old people. The fact that they're going to have a kid at all, already a miracle, let alone thousands upon millions of descendants. God is going to work a miracle. And it's not going to be through Abram's efforts. It's going to be through God. And so what is it that God asks of Abraham? What is the offering to secure the fact that God is going to provide descendants and you are not going to provide descendants? Well, it's the descendants making gland. It's the part of the body that makes the descendants. God says, I've promised you descendants, and that I'm going to make those descendants for you. And so as a sign that you trust me, you're actually going to offer up a part of the piece of your body that makes those descendants, because it is not in your power that you are going to be made into a great nation. It is through my power. And what we see is that this covenant through the sign of circumcision is something that descends beyond Abram and goes all the way to his descendants as well. Every one of Abram's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, however long, each of them get circumcised because they're all proclaiming the same truth, that God is the one who will make us a great nation, not under our powers, not in our ability to have children and be fruitful and multiply, to bring it back that way, but we are only able to be fruitful and multiply insofar as God empowers us, as God gives us this blessing and this miracle. That is how we will be the people God has made us to be. So there may have been a couple of stops and like weird pauses here and there in this video. I apologize for that. If you have any questions, please feel free to talk to me. I've instructed all the students, make sure to talk to you guys about this because we are going through some pretty heavy themes. So be ready for those conversations. And again, if you have any questions at all, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to help. Thanks, guys.